It's late October here in Ireland. We are deep in the autumn. The clocks have gone back and Halloween is just around the corner. The festival of dressing up, scary movies and ghost stories. But what is the root of all this symbolism? It is the old Irish festival of Samhain, where autumn turns to winter. In this interview, the first in the series of ancient stories and modern meanings, we talk with Mary O'Donnell about the origins of Halloween and related issues. Mary is a retired archaeologist with a specialist interest in early Irish culture, and she explains these ancient stories and gives them modern meaning. Tell us a little around this early Irish calendar and how different it was to what we have today in the Western world particularly.
Well, I won't go into a lot of detail about the calendar, but the year was effectively broken up into 4 quarters, if you want to put it like that. And they were based around, based in the space between the 4 major annual solar events, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes.
Okay, between them.
Between them. So the dates were effectively 1st of November, 1st of February, 1st of May, and the 1st of August.
Okay.
So these would have been known in the early Irish tradition as Samhain, Imbolc, Bealtaine, and Lunasa.
Okay.
So basically the idea was, in a way, is that in the solar year, things are they're definite in a way with the sun. And how it was viewed was that in the between times, so that what would have been said is the veils between the worlds are thin. So they marked the transitions between winter and spring, spring and summer, summer and autumn, beginnings of the harvest, and then the transition from autumn to winter.
Which is now.
Right. Exactly. And so that's what they were looking at. And also the idea was that you had to, in some ways, because things were not so definite. You know, a solstice is a very definite event. You know, it's the height of the summer, height of the winter. Everything is, you know, here we are, longest day, longest night.
Yes.
That sort of idea. The equinoxes is more about balance, but a little different. But in those other spaces, what's happening? So is it winter? Is it spring? Will spring ever come? So marking those changes that are more nebulous was, in a sense, what they were interested in, because they were viewed as places of power. You know, in the change, and that's what we observe in nature. The places where things happen are on the boundaries. So this is what they're marking, the boundary between one season and another, between one time of the year and another, and seen as places of power, but also difficulty. So you had to make it a little bit, how do you make it safe? So part of what happened was people marked the boundaries. So, you know, we know in May, Bealtaine, the beginning of May, people would put wreaths of hawthorn on their gates or on the areas around their house in the folk tradition. And this is saying, okay, this is my boundary, come no further. Perhaps who they were saying it to, the spirits of the land, you know, what you fear, what you don't know, visits from the other world. These are the things that would be looked out for, you know, and each time of the year had its own specific traditions associated with it.
Okay, and so Samhain then, around this time of year.
Well, again, in the tradition, the calendar was different because,
yes,
as in many tribal traditions, the darkness comes before the light, just as it happens for us as people. We're in the womb before we're born.
Okay.
So there's the journey through the darkness and then out the other side in the light. And Samhain is about the beginning of the descent into darkness. So it is, in effect, in the early Irish tradition, it is the beginning of the new year. And yeah, that's really about that descent into darkness. It's also a very interesting piece because it is, preparations have been made for winter. You know, the harvest has been brought in. And the last job to do, in a way, was to decide how many animals you're now going to take through to the next, through the winter. Do you have feed for everything? How are you going to manage? So at this point you say, okay, I can't take these through. And those animals are then killed They're your meat animals, and that will constitute a large portion of your diet through the winter.
Right.
You know, as the other stores kind of dwindle or whatever. So this takes you through. Your blood harvest will help take you through. So there are other traditions, I suppose, associated with it. One of the things in the early Irish piece, they talk about the trooping of the fairies twice a year, once in November and once in May. You know, Samhain and Bealtaine, and the parts when they talk about those, they're seen as the two most potent times.
Okay, and would I be right? Is Samhain like the beginning of the year in
Yes.
the early Irish calendar?
Absolutely, yeah. It is. It's the new year.
So it starts with darkness.
Starts with darkness.
Okay.
And so that's, yeah, as I say, that's literally what happens to us. It's in many traditions. In, say, the Jewish tradition, you know, the Sabbath starts at sunset. And in the same way, you know, Christian tradition has come back to that in years. Now Sunday Mass starts on Saturday evening. You know, a Christmas Mass is now held, it's not at midnight, which in the clock would tell you, you know, here we are from one day to the next. It's actually at sunset. So it's that idea of when the sun goes down, the new day has begun.
Right.
And in the same way is when the sun is going down on the year, the new year has begun.
Okay.
So again, in the tradition, you have, you know, the ordinary things that people do. The idea of the trooping of the fairies or those sort of pieces is saying that there's a lot of powers at play. So the festival became Christianized. So we call it Halloween, All Hallows Even, All Hallows Evening. So basically when you move, we have All Souls Day.
Is the 1st of November.
Correct.
Yes.
But of course, it actually, All Hallows, it starts the evening before.
Right.
Same idea, darkness before light. And so we have, and that's what happens on that evening. What do we watch for? So you have the Christian tradition. You know, you'll go to Mass, you do your pieces, you're watching, but it's the time where you associate with the dead.
Right.
And this is the idea that even in the early pre-Christian tradition, the mounds associated with the fairies were seen as being open, and that
On that night.
on that night, and so that the fairies could come out and you could go in. So you had to be very careful what happened. You protected your boundaries because everything was nebulous. Everything was a little bit tricky.
Yes.
You know, and you had to kind of watch it. So that notion or that idea of the other world and the things we couldn't see
Yes.
being very important. So, you know, the Irish idea of in this world and in the next, not talking about reincarnation in the sense of, but in the next, that
The other world.
the other world, that is, and in the Christian tradition in the same way, people talk about the next world.
Yeah.
That we move from one realm to another.
Okay.
This realm we can see, that realm is tricky, we don't always see it, but there is interaction between them, and those interactions are more likely, particularly at Samhain. And Bealtaine in a different way, but at Samhain very particularly.
So the roots of this Christian tradition of All Souls and Halloween is around the giving time to recognize our ancestors, and that was very much part of the Samhain tradition. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying, you know, the sort of idea of trooping of the fairies, people coming from the mounds. I mean, basically in the mounds, which we would now call different names, the ancestors were buried. So in a way, it was about communion with the ancestors, that the idea that they could almost come forth and you could go in. So you're visiting, you know, spending time with the ancestors. And in the Christian tradition, you know, in the same way, we have different ways of managing those and the boundaries around that. The idea of dressing up. We're dressing up as the spirits of the dead, people wearing costume. That idea, I mean, transported now to the US and back to us again, and it's become associated with candy, but that's not really where it started.
Yeah.
But the idea then, so you're praying for the souls. In the Christian tradition, you pray for the souls. There's that time spent, you know, November, the month of the dead, and that idea of the month of the dead. You know, it's not just a day. You know, you're spending time with the ancestors in the darkness. So that idea of communing with the ancestors. And so it continues from the pre-Christian tradition into the Christian tradition.
And as
there's a
people,
huge value in that. I mean, that's
Okay.
the idea. I think people saw that having connection with the ancestors and the support that they would give, we don't exist without them. So there is that idea of that, the line of them behind us,
Yes.
supporting us.
Yeah. But was there a danger of going sort of too close, if you like, and dying yourself?
Yes, I mean, that comes around in all of the traditions, the warnings about going in, in terms of the mounds, spending time, don't drink anything if you're with the fairies, this idea of that you can go into the touch with the other world and you may not come back. Or if you come back, maybe only part of you will come back. So again, you need to be careful with the boundaries. The idea of that when at these potent times, things were tricky.
Fluid.
It's a good word, fluid, yeah, a very good word.
Okay. So can we look and see what relevance is that for today around this, facing the darkness, around beginning in the dark, or the value set that's associated with that? Can we look at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is, first of all, everything was rooted in the tradition of the year. The rhythm, the natural rhythm of the year. You're out all night in the middle of summer. You're harvesting later on. You can go from light to light. This is really the realm of darkness. Which you're ready for it, but we don't do that. We just come in and we switch our lights on.
Yes.
We live in towns and cities. There are lights on all the time. So we don't have a lot of darkness.
Of course.
We've had some darkness this week. No electricity. It's been a different rhythm.
With the storm. Yeah.
With the storm, we've been sitting in candlelight. We've been, huddling in, people coming together. It's a very different rhythm, a different feeling. I can't just walk into the next room and instantly have light. So you have a different sense of what's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So if you live in a world where in the middle of summer, you work from 9 to 5 or 8:30 to 5 or 8 to 5, or you're on night shifts, you're not working with the rhythm. So you do it in the middle of summer and you do it in the middle of winter. It is a rhythm outside of that which is outside the body, which is outside nature. It's outside of that rhythm. It's set externally set rhythm.
So it's part of the process of disconnection that has happened over the last few hundred years, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's about, this is the work world and that's where we live, but that is disconnected. I mean, the only way it's connected to the world in a way is because if electricity goes off, we can't function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we need that power. We need that power of nature to power that. However we get that through hydroelectricity, through coal plants, through whatever.
Yeah.
So we need that, but outside of that, we don't have it.
Mm.
So it is a disconnect. It's easier to see if you live in a rural area in Ireland, and your electricity goes out, or even if the electricity stays on and there's a storm, you might not be able to get to work. And it doesn't matter what the world work demands of you. You actually can't do it. There are trees down on the road. It's flooded. Something's happened. So you're more at risk. You live in a city, those dangers are further away, or those interruptions to the work.
And so you can then suspend belief that you're dependent on nature, that somehow or other you're independent of it.
Exactly, and there are shops open, all hours of the day and night. There are lights on. It doesn't matter. You open your curtains at any midnight. There are lights on in the street. There's something else. So it does that idea.
Yeah.
And there was a story that when did fairies disappear in Ireland? And they said it was when electricity came on.
Right.
Because it basically it shines light in the corners, into the shadows.
Yes.
We don't have shadows, and that's actually part of the issue.
So,
in the sense that darkness is also, everything casts a shadow. We all have shadows, whether they're internal or external, and in a way, we have become afraid of the dark.
right.
In early Ireland and in even more modern Ireland, in the folk tradition, 150 years ago, people, when they looked into the corners and they looked on the roads, they were looking around, and what they were trying to do was interact with what they couldn't see. In a modern sense, we would say they were it's what quantum physics talks about, the unseen world, that of dark energy and dark matter.
Right, yes.
And people were trying to interact with that in whatever way that they understood through their belief systems.
So not necessarily through fear and running away, but through an understanding and appreciation and somewhat of an engagement.
Absolute engagement, but also done through the stories and traditions that they understood. It was said even up to 30 or 40 years ago, Irish people didn't need psychotherapy because they had priests and belief systems that sometimes were Christianized, but they were belief systems that came and supported the idea of going mad, supported the idea of living in other states, away with the fairies, all of these ideas that were held within the traditions. And as we've cast out the baby in bathwater, we've become more modernized.
Yeah.
We've also lost the value of those stories and what they were actually talking about. Not every pishog was actually a pishog. Some of them were
being a fairy.
Some of them were ideas that if you threw the tea out the wrong way out the door, something bad would happen. I mean, those are not necessarily useful superstitions. But there were other stories and other pieces that actually were very useful to people and how they lived.
Underlying appreciation of it.
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing you have to say is when people walked in the world, they were walking through. Not through a void. When you walk down the road, you're not just walking down the road separate from everything. You are engaged. You're walking through something that's very full. There are stories, the stories of what happened here. There's something else. You're seeing myths and legends walking with you. It's very full.
Right.
It's not empty. And people come, when they come, from cities to rural areas, they get frightened because they say, well, nothing's happening. It's just not noise in the way that they experience it, but it's actually the fullness of it, I think, that scares people because there's a lot happening. Yeah. And it isn't in a modern way that we understand necessarily in quite that way. People in rural areas still live like that to a large extent. You're walking through things all the time.
Yes.
And whether they're stories of your family, whether they're stories of something else, areas are full. Sometimes these are useful, sometimes they're not. But there was a value in what happened. And I think that's valuing those pieces, valuing the journey into the darkness. Mm-hmm. So what will happen?
Well, we've certainly been journeying into the darkness this week with Hurricane Ophelia cutting off our lights. It was a very sudden introduction to the winter. Yeah. Maud, thank you for taking the time to talk today, and let's check in again on other important calendar dates and look at the symbolism and meaning of those as well.
All right, Victor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this interview of ancient stories and modern meanings, which we hope you have found both interesting and informative. We'll talk with Mary again at other relevant times of the year to continue the series. You can find more resources at clearlysustainable.com.